Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 2026 State of Housing webinar. Today, the Center for Housing and Neighborhoods at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research published the 7th Annual State of Housing in Harris County and Houston report, made possible with the support of Wells Fargo. In addition to building on key indicators from previous years, this year's report has special focus on rental and homeownership trends, demographic shifts, and the growing burden of insurance costs. Today's webinar will begin with a short presentation on key findings from the report. A panel discussion with local housing experts will follow. We invite you to submit questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also vote on questions to push them up to the top of the list. As time allows, we will address audience questions near the end of our panel discussion portion. Some of our questions may be answered directly in the chat by a member of our team. To dig deeper into the findings from our State of Housing report, I'm going to turn the webinar over to research scientist Steve Sherman.
All right. Good morning, Michelle, and thank you for the introduction. It's an honor to present the State of Housing findings for this webinar for now the fourth time. Before I start talking about this year's report's findings, I want to preview some research produced by our survey team here at the Kinder Institute. According to a forthcoming report, they found that 56% of Houstonians were at least a little worried about being priced out of their home. 58% were at least a little worried about their ability to pay housing costs. And a quarter were sometimes or more often worried about being forced to move. I share these survey results as scaffolding for our State of Housing findings to show that housing affordability is more than just a dollars and cents issue. It's something that affects the well-being of Houstonians and the region as a whole. On to the State of Housing report, I'm going to report on some top-line findings, the first of which focuses on Black homeownership in Houston. Specifically, the city of Houston saw a 16% decline in Black homeownership in only 1 year, a total decrease of 11,000 Black homeowner households during the most recent year for which data are available from the census. This is larger than the worst declines during the Great Recession, and the biggest we've seen since these data were tracked yearly starting in 2005. This decline coincided with an overall decline in homeownership county and city-wide in total. City lost 14,000 and the county 19,000 homeowner households. And when looking across both geographies and in homeowner households in the four largest racial or ethnic groups, it's actually only Asian homeowner households which increased in number during the most recent year. What's interesting is that these declines in home ownership coincide with a period when housing prices have kind of stabilized. Home prices remained level in the city and actually declined slightly in the county. We're past the high home price increases of the post-COVID period. Interest rates still a little high, but they're lower than they were a few years ago. And yet simultaneously, we find this major drop in home ownership. To this point, Warren's mentioning, while home prices have stabilized, other costs of home ownership have not. And affordability is not just the function of housing costs alone. For instance, median homeowner insurance costs in Harris County rose 17% in 1 year. And this comes after those same costs rose 40% in the 3 years prior. So unlike home sales prices, which have plateaued, home insurance prices have continued to increase. These home insurance increases have occurred alongside expanded FEMA flood maps, the drafts of which were issued earlier this year. And our State of Housing report complements some other research we've done on the impacts of those expanded floodplains. With the new draft maps, 28% of housing units countywide are in a FEMA floodplain, more than 1 in 4. With being added to the floodplain comes requirements to purchase flood insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage, increasing homeownership costs too through higher insurance costs. The places where the most single-family homes were added to the new floodplain maps are very concentrated, with 10 neighborhoods highlighted on the map on the right in yellow and largely in northwest Harris County around Cypress and Copperfield. These areas, highlighted in yellow, accounted for 40% of all new single-family homes added to the floodplain with the expanded boundaries. Onto the renter and multifamily housing side. So the growth in renter households and multifamily construction continues apace. It warrants repeating, as we do every year, that Houston is a renter's city. About 60% of Houston households are renters, and as of 2017, Houston has more multifamily housing units, which are disproportionately renter occupied, than single family homes, of which only about 75% are owner occupied. And we track the growth of single family rentals in this report as well. New multifamily housing growth is largest in the outermost parts of the county and in the innermost parts, just adjacent downtown. And growth is smallest in that area of the county between Loop 610 and Beltway 8. There's kind of a bullseye effect when you look at where new multifamily housing is concentrated. And the population living in rental units grew 7.5% in Houston in just 1 year. It's very clear that renters are and will continue to be a constituency in the city. On to the cost of rent. The rent itself did not increase that much from 23 to 24, kind of like home purchase price. It's much smaller than the increases of the past 5 years, but the majority of renters are now cost burdened in the city and the county, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. This is a new threshold. We've crossed the Rubicon here. We haven't had a majority of cost burdened renters in both geographies before. This signals the problems that local renters have, meaning not just the rent itself, but also the necessary costs of living. Probably related to that problem, renter median household income actually decreased even before accounting for inflation from 23 to 24 in the city and the county. Renter households are poorer even as inflation continues apace. Third, the eviction rate remains high, with one eviction filing for every 10 renter households countywide. And some of the areas of the county, mostly beyond Beltway 8, shown in the map on the left, have more than one filing for every 5 renter households. A truly surprising number and a phenomenon we're currently researching in another project. So in conclusion, rent and home costs may not be skyrocketing, but the signs of stress for homeowners and renters become evident when you look at other indicators like insurance costs, cost burden rate, and evictions. Before passing the mic to our panelists, I want to say something about those other indicators. A special announcement is that today we are unveiling the Houston and Harris County Housing Dashboard, which contains all the data from the report at the neighborhood level, much, 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 much more than I just presented on, so that you can see how your neighborhood and all the other neighborhoods in Harris County fare across scores of housing indicators. You can follow that QR code to see the full state of housing report and then follow a link to the dashboard. That dashboard also contains data that's actually not in the report, including counts of federally subsidized affordable housing at the neighborhood, Houston City Council, and Commissioner Precinct level. This dashboard is a joint project with the City of Houston and Harris County and their respective housing departments, and is a large part of their collaborative housing affordability strategy. And I believe some webinar attendees may have already gone to talks and workshops on this strategy. And we at the Kinder Institute are happy and honored to collaborate with the city and county and release this dashboard today. I want to particularly thank the research analysts who produced the data in this report, Aram Yang, Debelina Banerjee, and Andrew Kim, and then the web developers who built the dashboard, Christopher Brown and Kiet Din, for their hard work on the dashboard and the report. We shared a lot of challenges in this year's report. And the city and county have now come together to start to develop a strategy to address those challenges using our research. And so I think it's high time to hear from them and our other esteemed panelists. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Steve. I want to take some time to meet our expert panel and learn more about what this research means for Houston. So I'm going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background in housing and resilience. We'll begin with Amy Connolly, who is Chief of Staff and Assistant Director for Planning and Grants Reporting at the City of Houston.
Hi, I can't be on video. It says that the apologies, but it says that the host is disabled my video. So I'll just talk offline. Oh, I can start my video. Hi. Hi, I'm Amy Connolly. I'm Chief of Staff and Assistant Director at the City of Houston Housing and Community Development Department. I've been in housing for about 20 years, working as a city planner mostly, and then also in housing departments in Fort Worth, as well as Racine, Wisconsin. So I've been in Houston for about 2 years, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Thanks so much, Amy. Tory Gunsolley was the Chief Program Officer for Harris County Housing and Community Development.
Good morning, and thank you, Kinder folks, for hosting this great session. I've been in the affordable housing space and homeless space for about 30 years, and the last 15 of which have been in Houston, both at the Houston Housing Authority and now with the county. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tori. Julia Orduña, who is the Southeast Texas Regional Director for Texas Housers.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Kinder. My name is Julia Orduña. As Michelle said, I'm the Southeast Texas Regional Director. I've been with Texas Housers for 7 years, and we're a statewide nonprofit that focuses on low-income housing issues in all of Texas. We do focus on disaster displacement, disaster housing in general, and then we have been focusing on evictions for the last 5 years, particular to understand how rent relief and other tenant protections have been able to help housing stability, not just in Houston, but across the state as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. And then Courtney Johnson Rose, who is the Chief Executive Officer for George E. Johnson Properties.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be on the panel this morning. I'm Courtney Johnson Rose. I'm a real estate broker and developer here in the Houston market and have been for the past 25 years. I'm also the immediate past president of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, a network of African-American professionals with 110 chapters across the country. And I teach as adjunct professor at Prairie View A&M University, where I teach principles of real estate and land development. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Courtney, and to all of our panelists. We are very excited to hear your reflections on this year's findings. So we wanted to begin with a broad question about what was the single finding that surprised you the most this year, and why was it so surprising? So we're going to go in the opposite order of introductions, beginning with Courtney. So Courtney, if you could talk to us a little bit about what was the finding that surprised you the most in our report?
It was so many nuggets in the report and so many things to highlight. One thing that was particularly alarming for me was the number of evictions that we're seeing in the city. It reminded me of a briefing that I had the opportunity to be a part of in 2023 with then Secretary of HUD, Marsha Fudge. And she shared that the new face of homelessness in the country that HUD was seeing was women over the age of 60 because of the fixed income, because of the cost of housing, because of less opportunities to purchase, because of the cost of healthcare. All of these things was creating a perfect storm, if you will. And looking at the data, it looked like that perfect storm has hit Houston, where our seniors are having to make very difficult decisions between healthcare and housing, healthcare, food, all of those sustainability things. So that was the thing that just kind of struck me the most and was extremely alarming looking at that data.
Yes, I would agree. And I appreciate that context. I think it's really helpful for all of us to process this together. Julia, what was the finding that surprised you in particular this year?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would say I was too surprised of anything that came out, but I think the thing that really resonated with me the most, and kind of piggybacking on where Courtney was headed, that rents are rising faster than inflation. So when we're thinking about evictions, when the wage growth is nullified by that high inflation, we're not seeing the capacity to be able to pay for rent. And so the rents have been rising since 2010. We saw in the report, it said that the largest increase was in 21 and 22. So we really saw rents skyrocket. And while they have evened out, they are still at high levels. So what the report is saying right now is that over half of the renters in Harris County are cost burdened, which means that they spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs, rent, or utilities. And I think that is something that we really need to understand and sit with a bit to see where the issues are and how do we really support the Houstonians in their rent stability and rents, or in housing stability, and the cost of rent is really one of the big drivers here. And so I think the big question that you all land on is affordability for whom. And I think that was the biggest thing that really resonated with me. Texas Housers speaks about the four rights. It's the right to choose where you live, the right to stay in your existing neighborhood, the right to equal treatment by the government and to right in how they spend and utilize processes and policies, and the right to have a say in how all of this works. So I think the first two rights of where you stay and choosing where you live are really the ones that are at odds with rent just being out of reach.
Thank you, Julia. That's really helpful context. And also, I love this framework of being able to have the right to choose where to live and where to stay. Tory, we'd love to hear your reflections as well.
Sure. So I think the most surprising findings were all related to the decrease in homeownership, both specifically for the Black population, but also overall, and losing over 19,000 owner-occupied units, and combined with the drop in single-family production, with less than 5,000 units being produced in that year. I think that that's really surprising and kind of goes against the narrative that many of us have in our head of we are not always a boom town, but we are always growing and we are always producing. And you drive around and you see new homes being built, especially when you think about the unincorporated parts of the county. You see all of these new homes going up, but to realize that it is at a historically low level was surprising. I think the other thing that struck home for me, and I think it ties in with what Julia is saying, is all of this is local. And I think some of the more minor findings that were surprising was to look at the outliers of like which neighborhoods have had phenomenal rent increases and which ones actually saw home values drop. And so it's fascinating to realize that each neighborhood could have very different things going on with their housing situations.
Thank you, Tori. We always love sort of these counterintuitive findings, things that may align with our experience but may not. But also, as you described, these outliers, that what can we learn from those outliers? What's going on in that context that makes it different than this other context? So I really appreciate you pulling those out. And Amy, we would love to hear what stood out to you in this report as well.
Sure. Again, nothing was surprising because we're of course always doing research on affordability, but I just want to be sure to thank the Kinder Institute for conducting this research and widely publishing it. And for all the people on the call that are listening in and will read the report, those of us that work in housing sometimes feel like we're shouting into a wind tunnel about housing affordability. And so it's really good to hear a lot of the data reflected back in a very beautiful graphic way that is understandable. And it also proves out that we're not being chicken littles. The sky, maybe it's not falling, but it's certainly getting closer. And I'm really thankful for that because it's sometimes hard to convince neighborhoods and elected officials and people that this really is an issue. What always is surprising to me about Houston, because Houston has long enjoyed a competitive advantage of being an affordable place to live, somewhere where you can move and get a good salary and have a house that is affordable to your income. And that has been our economic advantage for 70 to 80 years. But this research that you're showing and the research that we're also finding in our city and county strategic affordability study is that the affordability gap in certain populations is declining for home ownership. And the affordability gap has always been an issue in rental housing for many, many years. And when we have also decreases in affordability in that single family housing market, that then impacts the rental market and makes rental housing less affordable too. So it's all related, and I'm just really pleased that you're doing the research.
Thanks, Amy. And yes, we appreciate the shout out and similarly feeling like we are shouting into the ether sometimes, but also how you highlighted how interconnected these things are and to see the relationships of what is happening in homeownership impacts renting. And so for all of us to bring to bear our own experiences in working in government and as a realtor, developer, housing advocate, we really want to learn more from what you are seeing on the ground to make sense of some of these data because the data only tell part of the story. So we wanted to shift some questions to direct to each of you related to your expertise and what you may be seeing through your experience. Beginning with Courtney, one of the most alarming findings this year was the drop in Black home ownership in the city of Houston. But we just report the numbers, and you work with home buyers and sellers. So, as someone who researches, teaches, and works in real estate, what are the important contextual factors that you see as driving changes in Houston real estate market? How might those be impacting who's buying, renting, or getting priced out in the process?
Yeah, so from my perspective, those that are being priced out are the long-term residents in rapidly appreciating areas, these gentrifying communities. Seniors, as I talked about earlier, on fixed incomes, and households without significant savings or inherited wealth. One contextual factor that I think we all need to consider is something that's being called the silver tsunami. So the silver tsunami is one out of every three baby boomers. That generation will transition in the next decade. That will change Houston housing tremendously. When you think about this, will be one of the largest transfers of wealth in American history as the baby boomer generation starts to age out. It will affect our older inner loop communities tremendously. It will affect single family homes that have been controlled or owned by families for 30, 50 plus years. In neighborhoods with very high Black homeownership concentrations, we will have to manage heirs property issues in those particular areas as those homes need to be transferred from one generation to the next. So the silver tsunami will certainly be one of those contextual things that change inventory in Houston. It'll change pricing, it'll change demographics of our areas tremendously. But even with the silver tsunami, it still is not going to address the inventory challenges that Houston has. And at the end of the day, affordability is an economic issue. It's about inventory and being able to create inventory in the city so that people can live in the city. And there's five obstacles that I see to increase housing supply, and we call them the 5L. So one is laws, slow permitting process, new detention requirements in the city of Houston. A fourth of the homes in the city are in the flood zone. How do we mitigate that, and resiliency plans? Two, land, the rising cost of land and availability of land is going to be something that really affects inventory and our ability to create affordable housing. Labor shortages are going to be a big issue with being able to manage construction costs. Lumber, the cost of construction to be able to develop enough housing to meet demand. And then lastly, lenders. The tightening of lender policies, the increase in interest rates, debt to income ratios are all things that have to be managed. So Houston housing will change, but our ability to create affordability in the city is really what the major challenge is moving forward.
Thank you, Courtney. We really appreciate your perspective. Tory, what county efforts are currently being planned to address some of the challenges from this year's report? Can you elaborate on some of them?
Yeah, so I think we're attacking the housing affordability and some of the challenges outlined in the report in a variety of different ways. So we are funding a number of eviction diversion programs which is both legal representation in the courtroom as well as very short-term one-time rent assistance. And that is being shown to be effective in stemming the tide of the evictions. But there's not enough of it, and that's kind of a common theme. At the most desire housing situation, homelessness, the county is working on rental assistance there, as well as case management and housing navigation. And then we run a number of production programs, and we've really tried to ramp up production of affordable housing, both multifamily and single family, as well as homeowner down payment assistance. And then I think on the flood damage and flooding risk, the county, has this county flood bond program, and over $2 billion has been spent to try to reduce the flood damage throughout the county. And there's another $3 billion in the pipeline, and it's being addressed at a kind of a system level. And then both the city and the county made changes to our minimum elevation and raising new construction to above the 500-year floodplain. And that will be helpful. But I think flood risk remains a real risk for many households. So I think those are a lot of the individual things that we're doing. I think the biggest thing that we're doing is actually working with the city hand in hand on a strategy for the future, so that we can partner better, partner consistently, and figure out which entities are most effective at doing which parts of this interconnected puzzle, and free them up to work in their own areas, and have a very clear mission as how we move forward. And I think as this region experiences future disasters, there will be future disaster recovery money. And I think what we both want to do, the city and the county, is be more strategic in how we spend those funds so that we can actually make a real dent in this affordability problem.
Thanks, Tory. That's really helpful and responds to Courtney's discussion about the need for producing more affordable housing. And so it sounds like this is a commitment, and obviously these are all hands on deck situation. And so the city and the county coming together as a part of this strategy is really inspiring and exciting for how we can make our money go as far as we want it to go, and to address the issue of climate, as we are all anticipating how much rain we're going to get in the next couple days. And we saw this year's report indicate a huge number of flood vulnerable housing countywide. So the county's efforts to really address flood vulnerability and how that intersects with affordability when we have additional funds and when we don't is really, really important. So thank you for sharing that. Amy, what city efforts are currently being planned to address some of the challenges from this year's report? I know you're doing work alongside the county, but if you could tell us a little bit about what the city is doing, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Again, I just want to hype the strategy. We have both the city and the county have really limited amounts of funds available to do housing. Majority of our funds are coming from the federal government, and sometimes that funding seems a little shaky. Like we don't know from year to year if Congress is going to give us an allocation. And then as we get funding, that allocation has been largely flat for many, many years. And when you factor in inflation, it just feels like the amount of money that we have is getting shorter and shorter. And that's when you have to apply strategic methods to say, okay, we have to prioritize. We have to figure out exactly where we're going to put the money and what partners we need to deliver on housing so that we can actually make an impact. So I just want to say that's a large part of our work right now. But we have existing programs that we're working on. For example, we have a home buyer assistance program that has been really successful using a combination of federal funds and also disaster recovery funds. We have a multifamily NOFA out right now. I think it's closed officially, but that will be awarding disaster recovery and also some federal funds to incentivize multifamily housing. We, of course, also have NOFA out to incentivize and help with community housing development organizations, or CHODOs, build single-family affordable homes in the community. And we continually work closely with our partners, the Housing Alliance HTX, the former Housing Authority, it's their new name, and the Houston Housing Finance Corporation, to really maximize the available incentives that we have, like property tax incentives, to help build more affordability. So that's where our work is mostly. And yeah, it's very similar to what the county does. We just have different jurisdictions that we work in.
That's very helpful context, and helpful to understand how the process works. We wanted to also ask a follow-up question related to home ownership. We saw a lot of the post-COVID gains in home ownership are declining in Houston, particularly for certain populations. And as Houston becomes more of a renter city, how does City Hall react? And what in particular are the issues or policies that you see important in light of these data?
Yeah, well, Houston has always been a renter city, and and again, we talked about the issue when you have declining home ownership, that puts a lot of pressure on the rental market, and then that in turn can make the rental market have deeper affordability gaps. But what we're seeing in our research in the strategy, and you showed a lot of this research too, is that affordability gap is getting wider, and the affordability gap is also going up the income spectrum. At times, affordability is usually can hit a lot at 60% AMI, area median income and below, but now we're seeing affordability stressors at 80% AMI, up to 100% AMI for renter housing. And that is largely because of the decline in available affordable single family homes for people. So they're kind of stuck at being renters. City Hall has responded just recently. Our city elected officials passed a new rental inspection ordinance to really address multifamily issues, and it's really addressing the worst apartment owners and really trying to force change in the quality of that housing. It's not a perfect ordinance, but I think it's a really good start. We worked really closely with Julia and all of our partner agencies to make sure that we were, addressing the right issues in that ordinance. And we're really excited to see that implemented and how that will hopefully change the trajectory of multifamily housing in the city. I think also, we're all really excited about what's going to come out of our affordability strategy. And the key here is that we have to think about ways to maximize our funding and add in funding where we have it. Houston's got this fantastic philanthropic community, and they have expressed interest in investing in affordable housing. But the question is, where? Where would you invest? And so we look to things like Seattle's, Steve Ballmer Fund for housing that was created out of philanthropic organizations and corporate entities really looking to make sure that housing was affordable for their workers. And we kind of look at that kind of model and say, is that something that we can build on? Is that something that is even possible for Houston? And so we look at that to try to utilize funding outside of the very limited and declining federal funding that we're experiencing. So that's kind of what's going on at the city.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you for talking about how we're attempting to do more with less, but also just how widespread the housing crisis is, talking about how this is impacting how the apartment inspection ordinance deals with the worst of the worst. And so it's a really important protection that was not there before these really great efforts to create accountability and safe and healthy and habitable housing, but also the issues that are addressing people higher up at 120% of the area median income, and how they're also feeling this crunch and these pressures. And so the issues that they may be facing are also real, and how to address those, and workforce. How do we make sure people have housing that's affordable and accessible to their work? So we know these are very complex, multi-issue issues that boil down to housing. And so it's really helpful for you to explain a lot of the work that is a part of the broader city-county strategy and the efforts to address these pressing issues. So thank you so much. And then Julia, we wanted to ask you a bit. We talked about evictions, and this year's report showed some of the communities with highest eviction rates are in the suburbs, somewhat counterintuitive to people beyond Beltway 8. As someone who works in tenant advocacy, what challenges do you see that are unique to these farther out communities and complexes compared to evictions within the older central city neighborhoods? What is driving high eviction rates? Obviously, a lot of people can't pay rent, but are there property management practices or institutional factors that drive high evictions in certain properties?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think, I mean, we've already talked about wages not being caught up with the rate of inflation and rent and people being cost burdened. I think Table 10 in the report really highlighted that as the changes in wages declined. I think the other thing that may be happening, and Courtney talked a little bit about it with the silver tsunami, is that these ownership levels are declining. So either people are being priced out, maybe people can't pay to become homeowners. And I think that the city homebuyer program is a great opportunity to help support that accessibility. But the aging population, there's one of two things happening there. They're either being placed in rentals, and so they're going from home ownership into these elderly facilities or something that they're becoming renters. Or secondly, when they transition on and they pass on, it becomes this heirship property or it becomes an investment property for the family. So the family is now choosing between, do we keep the family, live in it, keep the home and live in it, keep the home and rent it, or sell it. And so a lot of these transitioning properties are becoming investment properties for families. And I think it's funny when you become a landlord, a lot of landlords don't fall into it with a financial plan and everything. It just becomes, a way to make passive income or support the family wealth building. So I think that's interesting how a lot of people just become landlords passively in that way. And so I think that might be a difficulty when landlords don't entirely know the law. And I know laws are changing right now, particularly with SB 38 that passed last year in our legislative session. Sometimes it's hard to catch up with these laws and not being a lawyer myself, it's really hard to interpret. And I think evictions become part of that they become more of the first line of defense to collect rent than the last line of defense when communication has fully broken down. When a lawsuit happens, it's usually for really poor issues or poor communication when it becomes like commercial or small debt. But when it becomes a rental contract between a landlord and a tenant, sometimes it becomes the first line of defense. So I think that's something that we're seeing in general. Thinking about further out, I think the report really touched a bit on build to rent single family homes. So I'm wondering where that's actually adding to the rental population. And we're seeing that just become a new norm. I think also when we're building further out in the suburbs, they become new properties. So new properties come with new amenities, and maybe those also become higher rents. So we're pricing people out at the same time when we're building these new properties. Inside the loop, I think we have a lot of aging properties in what we call NOAA, or naturally occurring affordable housing, that these rents are a little lower because the properties have just declined in quality over the years. And it's not anyone's fault. It's just that, capital improvements, wear and tear, and all of these things that we see in properties. So I think that's also something that we're seeing within rent prices. I think the other thing that really gets touched on is transportation. So when people are living further from the city center, maybe they live and operate and, their lives, their children, their places of worship might all be within the suburbs, but they might have reasons to come into the city, or they might actually work within the city. So when they're living a little further out, we're looking at transportation costs being that variable. And we know Gas has been going up recently. So I think those are some of the things to think about. We've also seen in the report talking about population growth. And so, as we have an influx of population, the majority of these people are also renters. So, when we're seeing this massive rent increase or tenancy increase, I think there's more opportunities for people to be displaced or be evicted. Things that I'm also thinking about that might be a less correlation and more speculation. I think disaster displacement is a big thing. We are in hurricane season. We just had a lot of flooding happen. And when we're thinking about capital improvements, there's one thing of being wear and tear. There's another when you are devastated in your property. And so if people and landlords and property owners can't make those repairs, ultimately these renters are being displaced. And so they're being asked to leave, not because the landlord is forcing them out for their own will. It's just because that they can't repair the property. And I think that this apartment inspection ordinance that Amy was talking about is really supporting some of that disaster housing, that we just need to live in healthy conditions and have good quality housing. I think the other thing I'm thinking of is during the pandemic, market investments were kind of short term. And I think we've heard a lot of that through the financial market. And so right now, we're seeing either properties change hands for multiple reasons. And I think when properties change hands, there might be mass displacement happening, that the new owner is asking all of these people to be evicted or to leave. And then the other thing I think was really pointed out was serial evictions. When a renter wins their case, maybe because of administrative issues, maybe because they did catch up on rent, but the following month they fall behind on rent too. So if we're seeing the same household being evicted over and over again, either by the same landlord or once they move, they're moving to a rent that's also out of reach because it is cost burden to them. So when they're moving to a property that is already cost burden to them, they are at risk of being evicted again. And so we're seeing some of these trends happen in the evictions and how people are moving. I think everything is also a little nuanced, so it depends on how deep down the rabbit hole you want to go. But I think these are some of the trends that we can kind of pick out of the report, or the things that we know in how evictions and rentals and home ownership is all kind of trending within the city and the county.
Thank you, Julia, for that comprehensive discussion of evictions, because it is a complex issue. And this is something that we are trying to get at in the State of Housing report about all of we know rent or mortgage payments is in some ways the cost of housing, but we know the cost of housing is a lot more than that. It's insurance, it's property taxes, but it's also the cost of upkeep. And transportation to work as you, or if you are displaced, or if a disaster happens, whether or not you are directly paying for that, or you get displaced and the cost of moving. And thank you so much for talking about all of the different factors that can cause displacement or eviction, in addition to new landlords who may not know the rules, or about properties changing hands, serial evictions. And so these different elements that contribute to the rising eviction rates that we are seeing, because I think these is very alarming. We definitely want to understand this better to be able to prevent, recognizing that evictions do cause a lot of harm to families, and long-term financial impacts, but also immediately pulling kids out of schools and disconnecting people from family, community, and work. So thank you. That was very comprehensive response that I think is really helpful to a lot of us in this space. So we're going to now turn to questions from our audience members. And I had planned to ask a question, but it seems like it was just answered by one of our analysts in the chat, which is wonderful. So I was going to ask one of the one of our audience members asked the question, you say declining home ownership, but the homes are not disappearing. So is the conclusion that homeowners are selling their homes to investors that rent them, or is something else going on? So if any of our panelists wanted to respond to that, we would love to hear your thoughts.
I think
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Corey.
I think there are a couple of things going on. One is household size is falling, so you have fewer people taking up more units. And second, it's tied to overall population growth. So the population does continue to grow, but the percentage is going down. And then there are units that are actually lost. That units are getting bought and torn down. And in some neighborhoods, it's replaced with two or three houses, and in other neighborhoods, um, they just don't come back online. So I think it would be interesting to look more closely into this, and I would love for Kindred to do that. But I think that's kind of my first reaction is it's multifaceted.
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted too. And I think again, it's a neighborhood by neighborhood issue, right? There's different neighborhoods and different price points. What you're going to see probably in places where the schools are better is you're going to see a lot of Airbnb and or rental housing conversion. So you're going to see people buying single family homes and converting them to rentals. That largely happens in places where the schools are really good and people really want to be in those neighborhoods. And in neighborhoods where the schools maybe are less performing, it could be displacement and gentrification. It could be any number of things. So it really is a tiny neighborhood market by tiny market issue, and you have to look at it separately for that. I wish there was an overall answer, like this is the one silver bullet that's gonna solve the problem, but it really is a micro issue on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis.
Michelle, let me add to that, particularly on the data regarding the decline in Black homeownership in the core city. One of the things that I think attributes to that is the increase in institutional investors
Mhm.
buying. Now, that percentage may seem low, but you have to understand the sweet spot of these institutional investors are usually between 200 and 300,000 single family, working class communities. So when you look at where that focus of institutional investors are and where they like to buy, we are finding that that is detrimental to Black homeownership in this core city because a average Black homeowner cannot compete with the institutional investor that's all cash, no inspections, no repairs, etc. So we find in a lot of cases where institutional investors want to focus their purchasing in is a direct competition to first-time Black home buyers.
Thank you. That's really helpful context. And talking about what are the different factors that contribute to this problem are really important for us to understand. Um, so I was going to ask a question that one of our audience members posed that one of our analysts responded to as well. But just in case any of the panelists had something they wanted to add, someone asked, can someone address the rental voucher option or any of the changes with the rental voucher eligibility to understand if this has impacted rental affordability and cause of eviction more generally?
Yeah, so I can chime in. I think at a high level, the voucher program has served fewer and fewer people. As rents went up, the amount of vouchers that are available went down. So, if the housing authority had a budget that in pre-pandemic served 1,000 people, they essentially get the same budget just adjusted for inflation. And when rent is outpacing inflation, that means that they can serve fewer people. And so that's what we've seen is this erosion of the voucher budgets and the erosion of the number of people that they're able to serve. And both housing authorities ran into those headwinds.
And
Thank
we've
you.
seen
Yeah.
the decline of housing authorities since the Fair Cloth Amendment in the 90s. And I think that the big thing that's happening right now is at the federal government, a lot of things are changing as far as right to notice to vacate, work requirements, a lot of things like that. And so really thinking about the vouchers the way they used to support people, things are really in flux. And like Tori is saying, that the budgets are tightening. So I think that's really where it gets a little harder. So I do feel the way that renter vouchers also work is they don't cover the full cost of rent. It is based on your income. And so you still have to pay 30% of your income. But now there are limits to how much well, they've always been limits to how much the rent will cover or the voucher will cover. Those limits have gone down a little. And so we're seeing that people are having to pay a little more on rent, even though they still have a voucher. So I think that's also starting to strain some of our families on vouchers as well.
Thank you so much. And I know someone else asked about whether changes to the voucher program may have affected homeownership rates amongst Black households, or if participation in the program creates barriers or disincentives to pursuing homeownership. Courtney, do you have any insight into that?
I don't think that it creates barriers to homeownership. I think the decreases that we've seen in Black homeownership are mainly focused around four things, and Steve's presentation kind of focused on this. One is lack of inventory, just being for Black potential homeowners to be able to find a home in the city at the cost, in the location, in the condition that it needs to actually be in. Housing stock in Houston is older. So average home is about 44 years old. So you have to be ready to do repairs to those homes, etc. So that has pushed a lot of Black homeowners not in a position to do that out. Secondly, cost. And it's not just price. Cost of insurance has gone up. Cost of repairs has gone up. Cost of property taxes have gone up. So all of these costs, in addition to interest rate increases, price increases, etc., have increased the cost. And when we look at some of the other racial disparities, for example, income disparities, it's a fact that Black women make 72 cents to the dollar of a white man. 87 cents to the dollar of a white woman. So if I look at affordability and what I can afford, if I make 72 cents less than my counterparts, it's just not enough income there to be able to absorb some of these challenges. Thirdly, is one thing we haven't talked about is Black millennials. So we are seeing a tremendous decrease in homeownership in Black millennials, which is particularly alarming because that's the future of Black wealth. But one of the things that's challenging for Black millennials is, of course, incomes, pricing, but student loan debt. And how you qualify for a loan is based upon debt to income ratio. What we have found, according to the United Negro College Fund, is that the average Black millennial graduates with at least $40,000 worth of student loan debt. So when you go to qualify for a home, you have to qualify for a higher priced home, higher taxes, higher insurance, all those other things, plus with $40,000 on average of student loan debt. And that affordability and ability to do that is just not there. And due to the lack of generational wealth in the Black community, due to systematic racism, there's not parents or grandparents that can help with a down payment, parents or grandparents that can help you avoid student loan debt. Those systematic issues all come into play to create this. And the fourth thing I'll mention again, just institutional investors that have focused in on this $200,000 to $300,000 price range where a lot of those Black families would be able to afford it. So the housing vouchers is a more of a rental issue, but does not necessarily affect those potential Black homeowners that could buy, but are finding themselves having to go out to the suburbs to find more opportunities to become homeowners.
Thank you, Courtney. It's really helpful for that context of what are all the factors that could go into this, these inequities, and we see income disparities, and individual wealth. But I love how you explained the role of intergenerational wealth. I know you talked about heirs, properties, and titling, and how do you pass down the wealth that exists, but how all of these things compound on one another for paying for education, being able to pay off student loans, being able who can co-sign for a loan for a down payment, and then being able to afford mortgage, and then if disaster happens. So I think it's really, as we've talked about, all of these things are multi-issue issues that really become visible through housing.
And we
But
see it in the data. And
What?
we see it in the data. The data does not lie. So we see those effects come out when you say, wow, this is alarming that Black homeownership has decreased more than any of the other ethnic groups, but it's because of all these factors.
Absolutely. No, and I think that's really important that we have these data, but at the same time, they don't tell the full story. And so it's really helpful for you to trace what is going on to explain what is going on behind, to explain these outcomes that we're seeing. So we had one question about, or we had a number of questions about the FEMA flood risk. FEMA associate risk with what community will look like in the future. How might insurance be affecting future housing affordability?
Well, we're seeing insurance costs both on single family and on multifamily become a bigger and bigger percentage of the overall housing cost. And until there is reform to the way that insurance is regulated, I think we're going to continue to see that. The insurance premiums really have two factors. One is the amount of claims, and the other is the investment that the insurance company is able to make in the meantime. And so that's what drives cost. And I think unless we shift to some sort of captive insurance group, and I'm not necessarily recommending it as an example, but Florida, for instance, and California have run statewide captive insurance programs with the goal of reducing costs. And I think that's something that eventually the Gulf Coast may need to consider.
Thanks,
One of the
Tori.
things
Yeah.
that I learned last year was that insurance is based on last year's storms and not the prediction of what might happen next year. So we actually saw a slight decrease in insurance this year because there were no named storms that hit the mainland of the United States last year. But I think the rates have been rising. So just to add a little context there too.
No, I appreciate it, Julia. And I similarly was surprised to see years that there were declines despite us knowing that it will happen. And so it's helpful context also for those of us learning in this space. So we're nearing the end of our time, but just to ask a broad question of our panelists, what do you think really needs to happen in Houston to counter some of these ominous findings that we were reading in the report? If you were to highlight something that you think we should be doing as a city, as a county, what would that be?
Think we need more money. I really do think that to equalize the housing, to bring more equity into the conversation, to provide more incentives for multifamily housing and to help people get into home ownership, there just has to be more money in the system. And we have to stop relying on only federal funds, right? Like there has to be a local source of funding, and there has to also be, corporate and philanthropic dollars mixed in here. And so that is what we're really focused on with the strategy is, okay, the federal funds are not growing, they're maybe decreasing in effective use. How are we gonna do this? The other thing is that we have to keep home building. And I mean all home building, like market rate, multifamily market rate. We have to keep building at the same levels that we have been doing traditionally. And that has started to decrease since the pandemic for all the variety of reasons we've talked about. But if we can keep housing production going in Houston, at 30,000 units a year, 35,000 units a year, we can keep the whole market, including the market for affordable housing, at a better rate than if we see a decrease. And we are starting to see some dramatic decreases in the provision of multifamily housing and also home building. So we really have to work on those two things.
And I can chime in. I think um, I'm an optimist, and so I think the silver lining of the report is housing affordability is becoming more and more of a challenge for more and more people, and that can translate into political will, because political will is what it takes to have more money to address the problem, to fix minor things, to fix major things that are regulatory or process driven. It's going to take all of the tools uh, in the tool belt to be able to make a dent in this problem. And a lot of those things don't get solved without political will. And so the more people that start to see that this is a problem that impacts them or their children or their neighbors, the more that they're willing to speak up and say this is an important thing to change. And I think that the city and the county are looking at a whole wide range of tools that could be deployed in a strategic way. And some of them, many of them, will take political will. So I think that that's the upside is that reporting like this and forums like this raise the awareness of the issue. And I think in Texas, it's never been more a part of the conversation. Both Republicans and Democrats in the state house are talking about bills around housing affordability, and they have different solutions. I'm of the opinion that we need all of the solutions. Um, and so I'm encouraged to see the conversation, and I'm hopeful that we will see change.
Michelle, I agree with all of the panelists. I'll sum it up with four things. One is barriers to building. We have to increase production. How can we do that? How can we look at the permitting process? How can we look at the how HQS building standards for the city of Houston? How do we incentivize builders to build in the city is one. Two, I think being more thoughtful about the down payment assistance program. A lot of times, what I see as a practitioner is those that can qualify for down payment assistance are not the same people that can afford to be able to purchase a home. But you have a group of working class individuals, teachers, et cetera, that are entry level into their positions. They fit more in the 120 to 150% AMI range, but to be able to have programs for them that are working class to be able to take advantage of some of the down payment assistance programs. Three is utilizing the tools that we have more effectively, the Houston Land Bank, the Houston Land Trust, our TERS, tax increment reinvestment zones around the city. Most of these major areas in the city have a TERS, but many of them aren't focused on affordable housing. How do we use those dollars to say, this is the crisis of this decade that we're going to utilize TERS funds for? So to be able to look at the tools we have and focus them all on this one particular issue. And then fourthly, political will. I do think that the stars are aligning, if you will, where this is not just a one community problem, but this is an everybody problem. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, has been a true issue for affordable housing. But as we educate our political leaders and we educate our communities about homeownership, about affordability, and how it affects everyone, this ecosystem that we are all in, I think that that will help us move the ball forward.
Wonderful.
I definitely agree with all of our panelists. And I think the big takeaway is just don't take your foot off the gas. We have a lot of these conversations often. The My Home is Here report that Kindred supported, that I know that like Tory and Amy are saying, there's a strategy kind of building right now. We're talking about all these rules, these regulations, these tools. How do we make them work for the people and the need that we have in the city of Houston? And really thinking about not just building, but building for our need and for the Houstonians. I think targeting at lower incomes, and I know that's the strain of financial feasibility, but the people that need housing are at the lowest at the 30% area median income. And so this idea of like trickling up, because if there is no housing stock at the lowest, then they are going to a more expensive rent that is displacing someone that could actually pay for that rent. And so that is trickling up housing instability. I think that there's a lot of strategies happening. And I think one of the ones that Tory spoke at very early on is eviction prevention. If we keep people housed, we will actually save money on the rest of the systems that are dealing with our unhoused population in either our law enforcement, our healthcare, our shelters that we know that we don't have enough of. How do we support people before housing instability happens? How do we make sure that people don't get into precarious situations? And some of that is educating landlords and having these discussions before we get into eviction filing. So I think there's a lot of little things that we could be doing to start moving the needle. And then there's those big things that can happen all at once that really progress. And I will agree that political will is a big part of that too.
Thank you to all of the panelists. I love this note that we ended on about the multi-issue nature and addressing all of these issues that are related to boil down to housing. And so people who maybe housing is not their issue, something else is, but turns out it's also related to this housing, and that can build that political will. So I think this is a hopeful, in some way, conversation about people recognizing the severity of the issue and perhaps engaging and taking action on the basis of that. So I wanted to thank again all of our panelists for being with us today and for such a stimulating conversation. I know I learned a lot. And thanks to our audience for your engagement with our research. Thank you to Wells Fargo for its support for this webinar and the report. And a reminder to please download and explore the report, the data dashboard with the city and the county, and our housing research at kinder.rice.edu. Thanks again.